I actually applied immediately. I got rejected because I was in high school.
Yeah.
And then I applied again. I got rejected again. And then the third time we came armed with a prototype that actually worked. The market is it's just like punch in the face. Like it teaches you a lot, like very quickly. I think our biggest learning is get in front of the customer and then just solve problems for them and start with one specific problem, regardless of how small it looks. We went from having no revenue to having 3 or 4 million in revenue in like a year. And it was like, well, we're done. Like we solved all the problems that are to solve. And then you're like, well, no, actually the game starts now.
I'm thrilled to be joined today by Tanay Tandon, the CEO of Athelas Commure. We're very excited to have him because he's one of the leading providers of enterprise software to healthcare. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Why don't we kick things off? Why don't you tell me what Athelas is and what are you guys working on?
Yeah, Athelas Commure builds software products for providers. And so we have tools that automate their day-to-day workflows like Commure Scribe, which is an ambient documentation tool, Athelas Revenue Cycle, which is a payment stack. It's basically Stripe for healthcare and doctors. It submits their claims, uses LLMs to negotiate denials with insurance companies, appeal those denials, and then really render all of the data viz and business intelligence to run your practice from a financial standpoint. And then also a whole host of clinical tools, Commure Engage, which does back office and front office interactions with the patient, explaining their bills to them, explaining what types of tasks they need to do to get prepared for a procedure like a colonoscopy, sending them appointment reminders. We do on the order of a couple $1 billion worth of payments volume every year, help document using our Ambient AI tool 20 million appointments every year, and then probably 150 million touch points annually on our patient engagement piece, spread in large health systems and private practices.
And so this is sort of a bundle of pieces of software that are each solving kind of independent problems for a practice and collectively sort of serve as the software operating system for this entire practice.
That's right. And so, our solutions are used by the physicians and the nurses in the practice or the hospital, and then also by the back office. So your accountants, your billing team, what we call revenue cycle in healthcare, everything from submitting the claim to actually ledgering everything up for the CFO's office.
And you can actually do all of this with technology today. You can have an AI model that'll call up an insurance company and negotiate with them, and that actually works.
100%. I think the ability for language models to both interact via voice and text with humans, we just got there a year ago. And so we're just at the precipice of what it can accomplish. And when you walk into a health system, there are tens of thousands of people whose sole job it is to do these types of tasks. And if you can free up their time, you can bring that productivity back onto what matters the most, which is patient care.
And I imagine a lot of those tasks are already outsourced to some degree. So you're kind of just slotting in to where they've already outsourced it to someone else.
Exactly. They use vendors like R1, which is an offshoring RCM provider, Access, Omega. Many of them have their own in-house shops where they actually, it's effectively outsourced, but they actually have the individuals on site. And the direction of the industry for the last 20 years has been offshoring. It works okay for what it's worth. These became big businesses, but I think LLMs, there's an opportunity to reimagine all of that where it's pure software.
And this ultimately becomes a product offering for all types of hospitals, both small and large.
Yep. We work with the HCAs of the world, which is a $100 billion hospital empire, 3,000 sites of care, 186 hospitals, all the way down to your private practice owned by a single physician. And they use varying parts of the solution, but it's provided as one platform, which is revenue cycle, workflow automation, and patient engagement in one.
What does that actually mean? Like for someone who's not in healthcare, like what do these roles actually look like in terms of where technology fits into them?
Yeah, the way I think about it is the physician's day-to-day is really defined as interacting with a patient and treating that patient, and then often generating the relevant documentation so that their back office, which is, think of it like their accounting team, their AR team, invoicing, can actually submit those claims to insurance. Yep. One of the challenges in healthcare is the person paying for the service is not the person receiving that service.
So a person paying is like an insurance company or Medicare or whatever.
Exactly.
The person receiving it is the patient.
Is the patient themselves. And that individual, the beneficiary, their incentives are to get treated fast, to get the best treatment in the world. And often the insurance company's incentive is to pay out as little as possible and hopefully treat as little as possible, which is a counter incentive to really what the patient is trying to accomplish.
And so when it comes to then building technology, then you guys build technology for all parts of this, from the patient experience itself, as well as the kind of front and back office accounting and kind of administration of that patient experience.
We see it as, there are two key protagonists in our story, which is the patients and the providers, and we build software solutions and hardware solutions for that group of individuals. And there's an effective enemy that's created as a result, which is the insurance company. And all of our tools are pointed at the payers in terms of trying to make their lives harder and make the lives of our customers easier.
Okay, very interesting. Okay, I want to dive into your technology, but before that, I'd love to hear a little bit about the backstory of Athelas. Yes. So why don't we rewind the clock to the very early days? Like, how did this company come about? Like, what was the very early days like? What was your experience at YC like? And kind of how did you even begin to arrive at this idea that you're working on now?
So I was very fortunate to have grown up in the Bay Area. Okay. And when you're in the Bay Area, Y Combinator is just in the ether. Like, people like Kassar and Justin Kahn and Sam Altman were like our heroes. And I remember it was like 2013 or 2014 that we somehow snuck into YC Startup School because it was happening in Cupertino.
I think I was there too, actually, also sort of snuck into it.
It was a great startup school. I think Zuck came, Jack Dorsey was there.
Yep, same one.
Flexport did their interview on stage. And I remember I was like a teenager in high school, and I was just in awe of these people that had built such amazing technology. And YC is this ecosystem that had enabled a lot of it and was starting to enable more and more of it. So, fast forward a couple years, Y Combinator hosted this hackathon called YC Hacks. And I had read a couple papers about how you could use computer vision to potentially analyze blood cells and also use really cheap pieces of glass to enhance a smartphone camera to basically turn into a microscope.
So this is like in 2016 or 17?
This is 2014.
2014, okay.
Like 2014.
Cool. So this is like early computer vision, like deep learning is like just starting to happen to some degree. Yes. Computer vision is just barely starting to work. Yeah.
The models that we were using them were like, even like for computer vision were, you're using like segmentation algorithms like Watershed and like, like random forest is what were like the best models for often NLP and even in some tasks in computer vision. And so armed with those two pieces of information, I went to YC Hacks and built this little really hacked together smartphone camera with a random forest that had been trained to classify malarial cells versus non-malarial cells based off of a training set on the internet. And it worked like pretty well. Like you could segment these two. Yeah. And then, I was a senior in high school at the time, but it became my science fair project that year. Nice. And I got very obsessed with this idea of, man, we can use computer vision to automate a task that someone like a pathologist, a very trained person is doing in a expensive laboratory, and bring that care directly to the patient and simplify the provider's life. And that eventually became Athelas, which was started as a med device diagnostics company.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so when you applied to YC then, so this is shortly after that, maybe a year or two after you were a freshman in college or something like that?
So I actually applied immediately. I got rejected because I was in high school.
Yeah, makes sense.
And then I applied again. I got rejected again. And then the third time we came armed with a prototype that actually worked. And it was after I'd spent about 6 months at Stanford, and the resources that you have access to with the med school and the in the mechanical engineering department, like we were able to put something pretty serious together. And that's when we got in for summer 16.
And this was with a med device that was doing some type of kind of image-based analysis.
That's right.
Was this original idea of like blood sample analysis?
That's right. So it was basically taking a small volume of blood, turning it into a monolayer, so you could see single cells basically like they were on a smear, and then basically a microscope with an imager attached to it, but it was hacked in a way that it was very large field of view and still high resolution. And then we trained computer vision algorithms to recognize and segment those various cells.
And so at this point, your background is primarily in computer science, I assume. You had some experience in this application area in biology in high school and early college. What gave you the conviction to be like, I'm gonna presumably drop out of college, start this company that is in a regulated industry with medical devices? Like, how did you actually arrive at that conviction?
I would say two key sources. One, my co-founder Deepika, who's also one of my closest friends, we used to compete in science fairs against each other, and her research was always way more, call it med device or bioengineering focused, and she worked through high school on this microfluidic test strip that could detect salmonella very quickly from produce. And I thought it was remarkable that you could build something like that in high school, because it was hardware, there was bio involved. You have to have a good understanding of how these detection strips were actually fabbed and cut and whatnot. And so it was clear that we could build things in the real world with microfluidics. And then number two, I think when you're at Stanford, you get to meet these amazing professors. For me, Chris Manning was someone who gave me my first shot in the Stanford AI lab under Richard Socher, who started MetaMind, where I was a research intern as well. And I think it was really motivating because for them, it was like, there's no boundaries to what machine learning can do. You should go after these complex industries. And Richard ended up being the first check right after Y Combinator. It was
cool.
a $50K check. And I think that support really encouraged us as well.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so let's now talk about your time in YC. At this point, it's just the two of you. You're working on this regulated medical device. What did you set as kind of your demo day goal? Like, what did you accomplish in those few months of YC that ultimately then put you on a trajectory to build something somewhat different now from what you describe now? And we'll kind of talk about that transition. But yeah, what did that first few months look like?
I think the first week itself of YC was total shock because we came in with these traditional timelines for how long a med device should take or how long anything in healthcare should take.
Which is like years or something.
Years.
Yeah.
And that seemed pretty good to me. I was like, cool, like we're gonna be on this for a long time. It's, we're gonna go super slow. I remember I had a conversation with Kassar, who was our group partner and is also now on our board. And he was basically like, he made me walk through every assumption on, well, why is that months? That just seems like it's like paperwork. You should be able to do it in a week. Why are you waiting for Stanford IRB to approve this trial where you could go to some local lab and probably get it done in a week? And I think because of that, Deepka and I sat down and just like reimagined how quickly you could build this stuff and really went from almost like zero-based budgeting, but for a clinical trial. Right, totally. And the other piece was, if you're a competitive person, in our batch, we had companies like, Scale AI was in our batch. And this was a company that pivoted mid-batch and got to like millions in revenue by the end of the batch. For us, we never wanted to just be the best healthcare company in the batch. We wanted to be the best company in the batch. And so it was this pressure that we sort of created for ourselves and the group partners created that really caused us to pace more aggressively than if we were doing it outside of YC. And so we set this goal of, we will finish a clinical trial and have a ready to go FDA submission by the end of YC. And it was crazy, but we actually got the clinical trial done. We needed to redo some of the experiments per the FDA's request. So the approval itself took a little longer, but we got the core basis of the clinicals done in those 10 weeks.
I mean, that's pretty absurd pace, right? I mean, I think like when you think about a normal regulated medical device, we're talking about many years in that process. And yeah, I think this ability to kind of break down into its only what the critical components of it are, what parts you can actually shortcut versus not it's a very challenging headspace to get into. And then you guys as 19-year-olds, I mean, I can only imagine some number of people who you talk to are like, who are these guys to be making a medical device? Like, how do you go up against that? Like, how did you get yourself to not care, basically?
We had many conversations where we got a quote from Stanford where it was like, we can run this trial and it'll be $120,000 and it will take 3 years. Right. And I mean, when you see something like that, it's almost so absurd that it wheels you into action a little bit, which is like, if this is the default system, I mean, something is broken. And I think because of that, we thought to ourselves, it's time to rethink first principles. And it really came down to, one, identifying a partner hospital that was small enough and willing to work with us very quickly. And that ended up being in Juarez, Mexico. So we flew out there mid-batch, ran the trial with them. Number two is really deleting as many parts as possible and running the simplest form of the trial. So instead of hiring traditional clinical trial operators, Deepika and I ran the trial ourselves. She took samples in the front room. I was in the back room running them on the device. And then we had a nurse that we had hired for the day who was running them on the traditional system called the Sysmex XE5000. And we would then compare those results and show that they were accurate and equivalent to each other. And the whole process from finding the hospital to making sure the devices were ready to actually running the trial and then getting the results, end to end was probably 6 weeks of the batch. Once we hit those milestones, that's when we raised our seed round.
Okay, so what you started there though, you started with this medical device. Today, you're not a medical device company for the most part, at least, or at all, I think. What was that arc like? I'm sure there was many steps in which the company changed, but maybe tell me a little bit about how you segment your brain into like the few eras of this company and how you went from one of these to perhaps pivoting to kind of another version of that company over the last few years.
We did YC. We raised our seed round from Sequoia, Alfred over at Sequoia. And the next 18 to 24 months just became brutal focus on getting an FDA clearance. Get the device to a state where it can replicably run in clinical trials, where you can, all kinds of crazy tests. Like we have to drop the device and kick the device and, things break and you have to be able to continue to pass the relevant tests. And that was it. We were laser focused on this one goal. And I think that was very freeing in some ways because it was the only thing we had to get done. We also only had $3 million to do it. Right. And the other piece of it was to start proving out the commercials. And that's when I started engaging with what became our first customer, which was actually a pharmaceutical company that manufactured a drug called clozapine, which is a refractory schizophrenia treatment that causes neutropenia, white blood cell count reduction as a side effect. And they told us we've been dreaming about a device like this. And they signed that first $1 million contract even before we had approval, just based off of the results of the clinical. So we had that commercial proof. We had early clinics that were adopting it and we were seeing them use it. And then we got the FDA clearance. And that was really the first epoch of the company, the first 2.5 years. Once we got that, the market is a great, it's just punch in the face. Yes. It teaches you a lot, very quickly.
You must have felt like you were on cloud nine then. You're like, oh, we're chilling. We figured this out now. Now we're going to go to the moon with this.
We got the clearance and it was like, well, we're done. We solved all the problems that are to solve. And then you're like, well, no, actually the game starts now. Right. And the exciting thing was that we went from having no revenue to having 3 or 4 million in revenue in a year. So as far as traditional Series A metrics and pacing, we were there. The thing that we realized in parallel was, okay, we can probably scale this business to tens of millions in revenue and build a business that a Roche or an Abbott or someone will buy for, $200 million or whatever that number is, a good med device outcome. At the same time, we had this team that we felt could run through walls and had built machine learning software, had gone through regulatory, had done the operations of device manufacturing. And we were in these clinics, our devices were deployed, and we saw all kinds of problems.
So you got in there by deploying the devices. We were solving all sorts of other problems that we're facing. And along the way, you discovered there's this massive other set of problems that you can solve too.
Yep. We wanted to go from making their lives easier for 1% of their patients who we were serving with our Athelas One device to 100% of their patients in their whole chronic care panel with the telehealth tools and the revenue cycle tools. And I think, looking back, the reason this time period was so valuable is we would not have had, a value-giving relationship with these customers had it not been for the device. They trusted us. They saw us as more than just a device company. They saw us as those kids that would show up in their office, set up the device, train them how to use it. And because of that, they would tell us about all these other problems they had in their clinics. Hey, when I get the result from the device, I have to upload it into this portal manually, and then I have to call up a pharmacist and tell them hey, the fax is coming through. We would just hear these, these complaints well, it would be amazing if I could, upload this automatically, or if I could fill this claim form out automatically to get the next set of medication adjudicated. And that's when we started building software. And it honestly felt like playing on easy mode after 2 years of building hardware and dealing with the FDA.
At some point, presumably the software starts to take off and become a pretty significant part of your business. At some point, what is that process like of leaning in on that and perhaps abandoning the thing that, or at least leaning out of the thing that has been your initial driver that got you there in the first place, that has this big pharma deal, for example? What does that process look like?
It was interesting because we had 2 paths in front of us: be the best Athelas One medical device company in the world, and just build a great compounding 40-50% annualized grower in that segment. Alternatively, it was bet on yourself again and expand the TAM and do more for these customers based on the learnings we were getting from the market.
And also, when was this, by the way?
This was in 2020.
So you've been at this now for 4-ish years.
Yes.
This has been your thing. You're a med device company. You're growing this thing. Now 2020 is coming. A lot of things are happening in the world, as I'm sure is going to be relevant here. Yep. And then also you're starting to see that there's an interesting new opportunity in software.
Yep. And I remember it was, I forget, it might have been Robinhood or it might have been some company. We had this interesting fireside that we went to, and they talked a lot about share of wallet and this concept of you want to do more and more for your consumer and go from just being, with Robinhood, their toy stock, couple $100 playing around, to no, this is a meaningful financial product for your entire portfolio. For us, the analogy was apt because we wanted to go from treating 1% of their patients, these refractory schizophrenia patients that were treatment resistant, to treating all their patients. And I remember Deepika, my co-founder, she was in one of these clinics. She spent a lot of time in these clinics, and she was like, it's insane. We are helping them for 1% of their patients and they love us so much. Imagine if we could build tools for all of their patients, their full 1,000 patient panel. And I think that's when we took the bet. We're like, we can build a multi-billion-dollar software business, sensor business in this segment by expanding what we do for these customers and grow a lot faster than the 100,000 total patients that had this one condition.
And then this was before the LLM era was really taking off. You were obviously a machine learning company and you had a lot of experience with building software. But like, what did that initial software look like? Like, what types of problems could you solve then? Presumably now you can solve many more.
Yeah, we started with the basics, which is one, COVID hit. And as a result, our providers needed ways to monitor their patients in their homes. So we built a basic telehealth portal and a set of remote monitoring devices that connected into it and allowed them to interact with those patients, many of whom also use the Athelas One device in the point of care or in their homes. The very next thing we started playing around with was workflow automation as it related to claim submission and payments. So everything from collecting dollars from these patients to starting to submit claims to insurance. And first we did it just for our, this subset of remote monitoring and clozapine patients, and then expanded organically to more and more of the practice.
And these are problems you basically discovered from being in their offices.
Yes.
Like, you and your co-founder are in there and you're noticing and hearing from them about whatever other problems they're facing, and you're kind of seeing, okay, like, as exciting as this is, we sort of have to solve these as we go.
Exactly. There is no other way to discover these problems than being in your customers day to day and just seeing them, because there's so much nuance to where they get stuck. Yeah. And it's not something you can derive, by reading an article or, watching a video online. You have to be in the heat of things.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think we see this with companies every day today, especially in this sort of new technological moment, is that it's very hard to conceive of great startup ideas kind of in your home or in a lab. It's much more likely to encounter them somewhere in the field by being in there. And so for you guys, that sort of was a game changer in putting you in that place.
100%.
Well, okay, well, why don't we, kind of move forward now a little bit to today, and I could get there by kind of talking about what the last few years has looked like in healthcare generally. I mean, there's been an incredible amount of changes happening in healthcare. To your point, there's these massive mega conglomerate style hospital businesses, there's consolidation in payers and PBMs. For you guys, as you see this sort of changing landscape, where do you fit into that landscape? And then also, how does that changing landscape affect your business and as you think about growing it?
I think it's really interesting, is if you go back to the 90s, the life of a physician was great. They had a tight panel of patients, they knew them personally, they treated them, and if there was chronic diseases, they were able to talk to the patient very quickly. Idea of a concierge doctor was fairly common. Anyone in upper middle class had a concierge doctor of some kind. And as the bloat that came from insurance and regulation and just what we turned healthcare into this sort of like admin state is what really broke down the productivity of a physician, where they turned into these cogs in this greater wheel, and there's patient productivity numbers they have to hit. There's countless tasks they have to do. Regardless of how efficient they are, they always take documentation home and they're filling out paperwork. And I see it as this great misuse of talent, in that we have some of the most intelligent, well-trained, well-intentioned people in the country spending their time doing tasks that really software should be doing for them. LLMs are not. And what we've seen happen is a lot of physicians give up on this dream of the private practice or the physician-owned practice in change for joining a large health system that does take on a lot of the overhead that you now need to pay in order to just operate a health system.
This is like negotiating with insurance companies and with PBMs and having pharma relationships and all that kind of stuff.
Paying for an EMR, dealing with malpractice. And so all of this made it harder to practice care and turned it more into this again, like this admin business. And I think now with LLMs, there's this generational opportunity to free the physician and really bring them back to what they love doing the most, which is rendering care. And I think our work is in service of that. Take the work tax and just nuke it. Take every part of their revenue cycle, their back office, their documentation, and use software to automate large chunks of that.
And I mean, you guys sell to both this mid-market and larger market or any kind of enterprise market. It feels like what you're saying here is that this mid-market is what you see as potentially best suited to take advantage of LLMs, and especially sort of this broader technological adoption, because it frees them from needing to consolidate into these bigger enterprises. And perhaps the advantage of the bigger enterprises won't be as much the case in the future. Is that kind of how you see it, or do you think not so much?
I think it goes both ways. One, I think we will see, it's sort of the analogy we use is like Amazon and Shopify, where over the last 20 years, or 10 years or whatever time period, Amazon has grown remarkably as it's, taken a lot of share from traditional retail and also expanded what we order online. But then Shopify has exploded as well as more people are able to start their own businesses. And I think you will have this aspect of the physician who practices in a health system, but then also has their own practice and chooses their hours. And because of the fact that software is automating more and more of their day, they can see more patients and do it in a way that is sustainable and gives them energy as opposed to drains them out by the end of the day.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit in terms of software automating more and more of their day. There's been a lot of software adoption in healthcare over the last 10 years, most of it through electronic health records and kind of payment portals with insurance and whatnot. But a lot of it has been promised to doctors as saving them time or helping patients in various ways over the last decade. But the critique has often been that, well, it's not really been about that. It's been about getting paid for care. It's been about billing mostly and not actually about care. How do you see what that technological adoption story looks like over the last decade and then over this next decade? What are things you think are going to be fundamentally different about this technological moment?
It's definitely true because a lot of the digitization and creation of EMRs came from a place of compliance and a place of billing and institutionalizing a lot of regulatory requirements as opposed to true, unleashing the doctor. Dr. Klasko, who's one of our, he used to run Thomas Jefferson University, the health system. He calls this the epidemic, which is like, there's just this proliferation of work tax in every org in the country, in IT departments, in the physician's day to day. And it didn't solve the problem it set out to solve because the software was built from the perspective of the CIO's office and the CFO's office.
Who are optimized around getting paid, basically.
Exactly, we're optimized around getting paid and not getting sued. Yeah. And those are the two drivers, the CLO's office as well. Now, I think you're seeing a lot of physician-driven adoption of these tools. One, post-COVID, we really stressed the system out. We burnt out our physicians or burnt out our nurses, and there's almost no option but for them to use these tools and push for the adoption of these tools in order to just keep up with their day-to-day patient volumes. Our loudest advocates, even in the largest health systems, are physicians.
Oh, this is really fascinating. That feels like a huge difference, right? I imagine in selling the first version of EHRs 5 or 6 years ago, you were largely selling to central IT teams, CIOs, that type of thing. Here you're saying today when you approach selling your recent software, it's an individual doctor who's your advocate.
100%. We have a self-serve ambient documentation tool called Commure Scribe. And
how does that work actually? Can you tell us a bit about that?
I would say it's one of the explosions in software categories recently. You've probably had, in terms of like really fast LLM adoption, I think you've had coding tools like the Windsurfs and the Cursors of the world, and then you've had ambient documentation tools in the healthcare world. And ambient documentation listens to the conversation that a patient and a physician have. It summarizes that, and then it generates all of the documentation based on being trained on previous approvals, previous pieces of documentation, and basically hands it off to the revenue cycle teams ready to go.
It's like a perfect problem for LLMs. It's things LLMs would be really good at.
It's a perfect problem for LLMs. You have transcription, you have summarization, you have references and citations back to clinical source material all in this one set of models. And that tool, we went from 2023 doing maybe 100,000 appointments through that tool to this year, we'll probably do 20 to 25 million appointments through that tool. There's a self-serve motion that has gone from last year's 0 appointments to this year 5 million appointments.
Self-serve motion as in you don't go through the hospital IT team at all?
It's a physician finds it online. We advertise directly to them. They sign up, often paying with their own credit card.
Wow. That seems new.
It seems crazy. I mean, I was shocked. When we saw this working, this is not behavior you've seen in healthcare before. Yeah. And from that, we then go upsell, almost like Slack or Dropbox or one of these traditional software tools, the whole enterprise, where we pitch the integrations into their EMR, the whole workflow tool, and that's been a massive source of expansion for us.
If I'm a founder, I might be thinking, well, isn't it going to be really annoying in terms of HIPAA and in terms of all these rules and whatnot, in terms of actually getting a doctor to sign up? Like, it's not even intuitive to me that a doctor is allowed to self-sign up for this type of thing. How do you guys think about that? Has something changed that makes it easy, or was it never actually as hard as people thought?
It's a good question. I think there's definitely a lot of compliance departments in hospitals that are very much against self-adopted software. But the productivity gains are so great that it's happening one way or another. And the options that a compliance department at a hospital has is either sign up and make this part of the institution, or tell your physicians to continue being burnt out. And usually they're picking the one that ends up with happier physicians. There are totally ways for there to be HIPAA compliant self-serve tools. Now that might defy the individual policies of a private institution like a hospital itself, but from a pure HIPAA compliance standpoint,
right. It's not actually a legal risk. It's just the hospital's own compliance.
It's their own internal policies.
Yeah. And so what does it actually look like in terms of other technological problems you face? Like what are some, maybe just diving into some technical challenges?
Yeah.
I can imagine for something like scribing, at least to me intuitively, that seems relatively straightforward as a technical challenge, but perhaps at that scale, actually, not so much. Whether in that one or in some of the other products you guys have, what are some of the hardest technical problems you guys face in actually making software here, especially for a company that is selling to healthcare as opposed to any other enterprise SaaS company?
In just the case of scribing, simple at first glance, but when you scale, you're dealing with millions of hours of audio that is often being uploaded over shaky networks in the basements of a hospital, in a lab, in a pharmacy that's a freestanding part of a freestanding clinic in rural America. So you have to build great offline mode and retention and the ability to upload these things silently in the background. And all these like traditional challenges that consumer apps have solved, I think, are now being solved in healthcare as well. Number two, we process billions of dollars worth of claims volume every year in our revenue cycle business. And as part of revenue cycle, it's Stripe for healthcare, right? You're the interface between the physician and the payer, and the payer's at 100 blocks that make it hard to get paid. Everything from losing the claim to, not telling you that it was denied for a couple weeks so you don't hit your, so you hit your timely filing limit and then can't get paid anymore. We've built models that are constantly checking for all of these threats. I almost see it as like a cybersecurity problem. Every denial is something broke, or this is the payer trying to attack the physician. We have to debug what went wrong and help the physician get paid out. A good example is all these payers have APIs now.
Right.
They just work 80% of the time. What that means is that you might get responses that are missing some of the adjudication, or there's a secondary insurance that needs to pay out, and then you need to go separately hit that secondary insurance, or these two insurance companies aren't talking to each other and they both got a medical record but are claiming they didn't, and you have to show them that audit trail. And so the technical challenges are very interesting because you're doing this at scale and you need to monitor these processes constantly. But when you solve them, physicians win, which is very exciting.
Yeah, and especially today, if they are your advocates, I think you get this even, I imagine, much faster sales motion than probably in the early days, where if you can show them these technical solutions and they can actually advocate and get your thing incorporated into their hospital, that's huge for you guys.
For our revenue cycle business, the word of mouth is literally, my revenue went up by 15%. Right. And that is the most potent word of mouth in the world. And that's why we're seeing that business scale so quickly. Yeah. I think in our Ambient business, the word of mouth is, I save 2 hours every day. And I did it with this free tool that I found online. And if I want to get it integrated, it's like $100 a month or whatever the price is. So that's to me why I think these tools are spreading so quickly now.
And how do you think about yourself in terms of the types of software you guys have? You call yourself sort of a compound software company, sort of a rippling for healthcare, as we've talked about in the past. What's the basis for that strategy? How do you guys think about growth and why grow this way versus doubling down on one of these and trying to make that be a massive business in itself?
I think the complexities of healthcare and the way that people get paid in healthcare and really where the operating cash flow lies really make it you can only really build a $100 billion business in healthcare as a platform company. With that being said, you have to start as a point solution. We started as a med device and then eventually turned into this, again, a point solution for a very specific subset of claims, and then over time turned into this platform. But now that we're this platform, we also have amazing distribution unlocks. We get to work with General Catalyst and their health assurance framework. They have 40 health systems that are all signed up. HCA is on our board. It's a $100 billion hospital empire. And so I think in the same way that in the 2010s, Palantir solved distribution in defense and a lot of, call it Fortune 100 use cases, and then just aggregated smart people to go work on crazy problems. We're doing that in healthcare. The hardest problem in healthcare, having now spent 8-9 years in it, is distribution. And you can reinvent the distribution wheel over 8-9 years for yourself, or you can go build, effectively point solutions as part of this platform, and not worry about the revenue engine because the back-end revenue cycle has that covered.
Right, as long as you ultimately have revenue cycle management at some part in your platform.
Exactly.
It kind of works.
Exactly.
Do you think that changes now in this era of kind of doctor-led advocacy of acquiring software? If for example, it is much easier for hospitals to acquire software than ever before, especially smaller clinics. Does that change the calculus there at all, or do you think ultimately the same dynamics lie?
What you will see is a lot of these like small couple million ARR businesses that might be distributed in this somewhat novel way now that physicians realize the productivity gains far outweigh getting a rap on your knuckles from compliance. Right. It's an approach. The issue is that the number of companies, there's like 40 different ambient scribing companies. They all hit like 100, 200K in revenue and then plateau out. And then the next kind of great wall that they hit is, there's probably a dozen of them that got to a couple million in revenue, and then they all plateaued out as well. It's not a venture business, in my opinion. Like a single point solution, unless you rapidly expand distribution or you rapidly expand your platform, it's not a venture scale business.
I can imagine then how you think about counter positioning to what might be many new upstart companies thinking about this. Like, do you think of it as kind of as long as we own revenue cycle management, these folks can basically help us innovate on companies on new areas, and basically you guys would go acquire them?
Yeah, our strategy has been, bundle as much as possible in terms of, we think long-term.
It's kind of the original Microsoft business model too.
It is 100% the original Microsoft business model. And a great example is in the 80s, there was a software that came out called Grammatic, and it was a word correcting software or like a grammar checking software. And, it ripped, like it really took off and it looked amazing. I think whatever the equivalent of VCs were in the back then, like we're super excited about the business. Like I'm sure they raised a lot of money from a lot of banks or whoever was funding them. And then Microsoft came out with autocorrect as part of Word, and this business just died. And this will happen, unfortunately, to a lot of these LLM wrapper businesses today, particularly in healthcare. I think there's a whole host of vanilla point solution scribing companies that have developed, and the minute Epic turns on their own native ambient scribe, those businesses will go poof because they have no connection to the revenue cycle, the payment stack, or anything more meaningful than just that one layer.
I mean, actually, on the note of Epic, how do you think about counter positioning to them? I mean, they're sort of the kings of distribution in terms of healthcare, at least for the last decade. Presumably, you're trying to take their crown.
Yeah.
But how do you think about counter positioning against their existing distribution?
Everything I just said is exactly what Epic would say about us.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so the way that I think about it is one of our core company values is speed. Yeah. And there are a group of health systems in this country who can't wait for Epic to build these solutions for them over a multi-year product roadmap. Yeah. I think the best stat that I have here is they're the two best run health systems in the country from a profitability standpoint are HCA, which is like $12 billion in free cash flow, and then Tenet, which is also billions in free cash flow. Neither of these companies are on Epic. In fact, they avoid Epic like the plague. And the reason is that Epic often sucks out all of the operating cash flow of the academics and businesses that they work with. We have these like multi-$100 million implementations. And the way that I see it is, if you want to be a fast-moving, growing business, you probably can't be on Epic because the CIO's office becomes this captured asset and they're just waiting for Epic to release stuff. Or at least Epic can't be central to your strategy. Maybe you use them for your EMR, but you're building the system of engagement and other tools on top of it and around it. And we aim to be that platform for that system of engagement on top of the EMR.
And it seems like you're innovating on a very different go-to-market compared to them too. To your point, they're probably going to the CIO's office.
That's right.
You guys, it sounds like, are experimenting with ways to go straight to doctors and then kind of make your way to the CIO's office from doctor demand as opposed to from some large enterprise deal that's forced on everyone.
And ultimately, you have to earn the trust of the CIO. There's no doubt about that. Yeah. But you can build a lot of momentum and add a lot of value through this physician-led adoption. Even at our largest health system partners, we have forward deployed engineering teams that will sit and just work with the medical directors and the leading physicians in that facility to try to make their day a little easier. And that's it. That's all their job is.
I mean, much like you and your co-founder in the early days.
Exactly. We try to replicate what worked in the early days into these forward deployed pods. And so far it's yielded. Like a lot of our net new products and a lot of our net new initiatives have come from that.
Maybe changing gears a little bit at the end here is I'd love to just talk a little bit about how you see the future of healthcare broadly. I mean, you obviously have had a front row seat to both participating in and shaping what this field has looked like for the last several years now. On the flip side, from my perspective as a patient, it feels like not a lot has changed from my experience as a patient over the last, let's say, 20 years. Again, if I were to go to a doctor in 2005 versus 2015 versus today, sure, more stuff is on a computer, but kind of fundamentally, I'm kind of waiting for the same amount of time and I'm talking to more or less the same people, and maybe there's a couple new things, but for the most part, it feels very similar. One, do you think that's an accurate characterization? And then also, how do you think of the next 10 years? Like, do you think it's going to look kind of similar for patients this upcoming decade?
I think for the most part, I agree, which is that the core of the experience hasn't changed. I think we're starting to see innovation now on the fringes, in that there's a lot of things that you had to go in for that you can now do via telehealth visit.
COVID sort of accelerated a lot of this.
Definitely accelerated a lot of that. And that's great. I think a system that is inherently supply constraint, the more that you can take out of, having to actually show up at this facility and wait for someone to see you, the better it is both for the system as well as for the patient. Where I think we're starting to see now rapid adoption is the physician's life is starting to actually become easier, in that these LLMs are saving them time, provably, a couple hours every day. And because of that, they're either going to, their panels will open up, they'll be able to see more patients. So getting an appointment with a specialist hopefully starts feeling a little easier, moving forward. But then number two, I think on the whole, these systems are starting to adopt AI-based solutions for things like their front desk to assist with, call automation, patient engagement. We have a system that for colonoscopy prep, it's called Commure Engage. It will send you a reminder and converse with you based on the source material and recommendation from the physician. And it improves no-show rates by 50%, because the prep work is done and you don't end up having to cancel the appointment last minute because you messed something up. And so those metrics are all moving in the right direction. I think what healthcare should become with LLMs in the next couple of years is, you should get your most critical care in a hospital or in in front of a physician, where there really is something like physiotherapy, like a PT actually taking care of you,
right. Or a surgeon operating.
A surgeon, or a deep complex diagnosis that requires multiple tests in one day. Those things should happen in an office. But with LLMs, more and more care, I think, can transition out of the home with sensors that monitor the patient, virtual care. And I think that world is finally becoming real.
And what do you see the transition of that world looking like? I mean, there's all these pretty deeply baked incentive systems that incentivize bringing people into the hospital, even for relatively small things, because you have to bill for it. And to your point, a lot of the revenue ultimately comes from RCM. Do you see that those sort of entrenched financial motives actually preventing that future from happening, or do you see that it's going to happen inevitably just from kind of this abundant intelligence age where we're entering?
I think it will happen inevitably from the abundance of intelligence that's emerging. I think a lot of your fringe care will again just be things that patients can do entirely on their own, and as a result, health systems will be forced to really specialize in doing those high margin, high dollar procedures that they're uniquely good at. And because of that specialization, I think the quality of that care will improve as well. And you see things like intuitive surgical and like robotic care. Actually, the fact that it's a thing in the States is pretty remarkable. So I think at the highest ends of our spectrum, technology has in fact improved quality of care meaningfully. There's like new immunotherapies cleared every year, et cetera. And then at the very lowest end of acuity in terms of basic telehealth, that's improved as well. And it's this kind of middle that's now getting
massive
squeezed
middle,
by both sides. And hopefully that the rate at which that middle gets compressed will be fast.
I mean, one of the areas you see the kind of big research labs most excited about is, like Microsoft, for example, put out this thing called medical superintelligence, on the path to medical superintelligence recently. And there's this sort of excitement around the possibility of actually, in many ways, kind of replacing or at least very heavily augmenting, but ultimately, fundamentally, in the long term, replacing the kind of fundamental kind of diagnostic process that a lot of doctors do with super intelligent AI systems, ones that could order tests and then respond to feedback and iteratively work on those. I mean, how do you think about those? Like, do you see that being as part of the future? And also, if that were, what do we need to do now to make that future happen? Like, what's kind of missing in the current world to make that happen?
When it comes to ordering, or when it comes to assessing a test and then recommending a plan of care, these models will probably surpass humans, and if not like already have surpassed humans. The idea is that just the way that our regulatory system is set up, from a malpractice standpoint, a litigation standpoint, a billing standpoint, you probably still want a responsible party. I think these health systems will be mega adopters of a lot of these tools of intelligence, because it will probably help them from a malpractice standpoint. If you can point to a model has synthesized millions of data points and come to this conclusion, and we're basically going through its recommendations, that's a way better world than doctor kind of stuck his finger in the air and guessed what was happening. And so I see physicians embracing what we call these super intelligent co-pilots that synthesize information and take action. You will probably still, for complex things, need to see the physician, get that final assessment, and then the speed and accuracy at which you go from not knowing what you have to then something happening, I think that will get compressed, which is net good. The reimbursement modalities, I'm not the world's biggest believer in this like value-based care world. And we've been talking about it for like 15 years. I just think there's something about simple capitalism that works well in America, which is here's a service, here's a cost, and we will improve the accuracy with which we render XYZ services. And maybe that requires better auditing, or that requires these super intelligent systems not recommending unnecessary or incorrect medical procedures. But this procedure-driven healthcare world seems to work. Like America does have good healthcare outcomes relative to the rest of the world.
Yeah, and perhaps, if there's significantly less unnecessary care happening where people are able to triage themselves in conversation with some sort of super intelligent chat system or whatever that system might be in the future with video and with sensors and whatnot. Perhaps that opens up the opportunity for medical professionals to focus on the cases where you can actually deliver really good outcomes versus clogging up ERs with people who don't need to be there.
100%.
What kind of future do you think that actually looks like 10 years from now then? Like, do you see yourself, do you think we're going to go to the doctor every year? Do you think we're going to only go when we actually have a catastrophic issue only, or something in between?
I think in 10 years, you're going to have you're going to have sensors kind of built into the home. You're going to have sensors that are, wearables on patients. The Apple Watch and AirPods are becoming medical devices very quickly. And that's a good thing, because that passive care where, we can detect things like AFib and, detect spikes in certain biomarkers is really good, because that's how you treat them very, very early. The concept of health insurance and the concept of how care is rendered is going to look a lot more like how our cars are handled, in the sense like auto insurance,
where like catastrophic insurance.
Catastrophic. And so when something bad, you break your arm, you have cancer, or you have a very complex disease, there will be an insurance mechanism, and really your insurance will be focused on that kind of care. And then I think the rest of the care, it's actually cheaper for it to be out of pocket and for it to be outside of the loop and complexity of the insurance system, where you can just get a direct prescription, or you can see a provider on telehealth or even in person for basic therapy. And because the system will have shrunk and we'll have deleted parts, it will become a more efficient system.
And do you also see it reverting kind of back to that version? You said in the 80s and 90s, it was great to be a doctor.
I think so.
Do you see in many ways the sort of consolidation we see happening in this field will at least slow down and perhaps even revert back to seeing more people open private practices? I
really think so. I would love a world where the market cap of a United Health is, a fifth, but every doctor is a millionaire. That is a good world for America, because patients are getting treated better. The people that are actually rendering care are where value is accruing. It is insane to me that, if you think about it, the most valuable healthcare company in the country, what they effectively do is send you a plastic card in the mail once a year.
Right.
Yes, there's, it's
totally.
straw man, there's more that they do, but really at its core, that is your interaction with them.
Yeah, totally. And then being denied claims, perhaps.
And then denying claims. And so it's an insane system. It needs to change. Way too much value is accrued at that layer, and I think it needs to come back to the physician.
Tanay, maybe just to wrap things up, now you've been at this for quite a while. There's many new founders excited about thinking about this current technological moment in healthcare and AI.
Yeah.
What advice would you give them in terms of how to compete with someone like you guys, but also how to build a business that can endure and kind of capture this current technological moment?
I think our biggest learning is get in front of the customer and then just solve problems for them, and start with one specific problem, even if, regardless of how small it looks. Our initial TAM was laughable. It was 100,000 patients in the entire country. But people and our investors and our team and our early founding engineers, they took a bet on us because they believed that we could take the momentum from that to build something even bigger. And so I would just say, don't be afraid of starting very small and very specific, because that is more valuable in the long term than trying to build a platform from right out the gates. The other thing that I will say is some of the best companies being founded right now are folks that came from the Palantir, did a tour of duty 6-7 years at a Palantir, didn't have to worry so much about distribution and just solve problems for customers, and then saw that scale and learned about the distribution. And so, my selfish pitch is if you're building in healthcare, one of the fastest ways to both become very wealthy is compound at a company like Commure, and then also learn these skills that you would otherwise have to kind of learn de novo that might take years in order to amass.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think one of the best ways to think about it, becoming a great startup founder, is to work at another great startup, one that's growing and one where you can get exposure to customers. I think that kind of forward deployed role you described feels a lot like the experience of an early founder, maybe with perhaps less total independence, but a lot of the same skill set that you might gain.
100%. Yeah.
And ultimately focusing on making things people want. Makes sense.
Yep. Make things people want.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Thanks for joining us.
Thank
This was
you.
great.
Appreciate it.